So this week, tomorrow, really, you have the extra credit assignment due. It is extra credit, so don't feel compelled at all. I know that I have kind of this general statement. Oh, Roadrunner. I've got this general statement in my syllabus that says you can only turn in a certain number of assignments late. This isn't one of them, okay? So don't turn this in late. So this is just available until tomorrow. And if you don't do it, you don't do it. It's no big deal. Your other assignments are due next Friday, and we'll look at some of those things here in a minute. We'll look at the extra credit. Also, kind of my general statement about how we're getting closer to the end of the class. I know we still have a month and a week. So we're not there yet, but that I know in the syllabus it says like don't turn stuff in late. I'm only going to count a certain number of things on, if you turn them in late. And if you've turned stuff in late, there haven't been too many of you. But I cannot have every single one of you turn in all of the last week's assignments late. So just keep that in mind, because my grades will be due, like your grades will be due Friday. My grades will be due Tuesday. So it's a super quick turnaround, and after next week, I'll probably talk to you about how maybe it'd be good if you actually turn stuff in once a week. So that way I can get the grades done faster and you'll know where you're at. Also, at some point next week, we'll talk about what you need to get what grade, whatever grade it is that you want to get. So point totals is what I'm saying. All right, let's look at extra credit really quick, if I can find it. There it is, hopefully. So the extra credit really was, my expectation is you'd watch the video, the Japanese internment video, which is about 9 minutes long, and it has really interesting music. And the narrator is Milton Eisenhower, who's Dwight Eisenhower's brother, and talks about why it was important, necessary for the United States to put Japanese Americans in prison camps and why they didn't seem to mind all that much. So what you would be looking for in that video is stuff that you thought maybe wasn't necessarily accurate. There'll be a few things in there that you'll be able to find. But you could also look at the propaganda posters or other things. I would ask, if you do this assignment, that whatever propaganda that you look at, that it actually be from the United States, because it's, U.S. history. But there's plenty of that. And you honestly don't have to use sources I've suggested, but I'm always puzzled when you don't, to be honest, unless you just happen to have your own source of World War II propaganda, which might be true for a couple of you, because sometimes you guys like stuff like that. The three or four things you really want to talk about in the assignment are here. Source of the propaganda, like who created it, if you have any idea about why. Intended audience, who do you think would see it and where they might see it. Any part of the item that seems exaggerated or dishonest. Typically, propaganda is exaggerated or one-sided. For it to be effective, it can't be like an out-and-out lie as a rule. It has to have an element of truth. However, that's not always true. And if you think the propaganda was effective. This is posted in the assignments page, and I may have put it in the course documents page as well. But honestly, I'd have to double check. Okay, what are we chatting about? Oh, single or double spaced, I really don't care. I think when I said 2 typed pages, my intention was double spaced. Well, I know that, I wrote this, so how would I not know? But yeah, my intention was double spaced for the 2-page limit. I'm trying to get you to keep it relatively short. I know some of you are going like, that's not really short. Maybe, I don't know. But double spaced 2 pages, but if you single space it, I'm not going to be upset. Oh, and look, I used the word for in there twice. Sorry about that. All right. And I wanted to point out some other stuff. Let's see, screen share. Sorry that I'm talking about what I'm doing, but as you get older, I'm just saying. Okay, the study thing for the timed questions. You have your basic list of stuff to study up here. So, make sure you do that. And that quiz will be available starting next Wednesday. I know it's too soon. Don't give me a hard time about that. It's too soon. Sorry. But some of the online sources might be useful as well if you're just wanting a little extra information. Your question this week is about the civil rights movement. And let's see. Oh, this video, where I say it's long, it's like a 30-minute video, but it's really good video about the early part of the civil rights movement. We're talking 50s and early 60s. I think it goes up through the sit-ins, but it's from, what is that organization out of, I can't think of it, the name of the organization. Does it say in the link? Sorry. I can't think of the name of it. I'll think of it in a second, but that's going to bug me, sorry. But it chronicles all of the major events of the early part of the civil rights movement. So if you've got 30 minutes, it's definitely worth your time. But if you don't, believe me, I understand. All right, let's see, chatting. For the paper, are you going to wait till the last minute? Is that why you're asking me this? No, I usually make the due time 11:59. So it's usually midnight or a minute before. Yeah, Kelsey's on top of this. Kelsey's going to be my assistant, so good job. Got to share my check with you. The quiz starts on Wednesday. Yeah, next Wednesday, not yesterday. Because it's the Wednesday when all the stuff's due. All right. Yeah, no, I'm just giving you a hard time about, are you going to wait for the last minute? Sometimes it's the only minute we have, so I get it. And it's not like I'm grading fast, so no judgment at all. And I know you guys are busy. And this year's complicated because you can't shove your kids off to school as much, and you might be working from home. I get it. All right. Let's start working on the minutes, notes. So too many meetings yesterday. Let's approve the minutes. All right, so we're going to talk about civil rights today, and then we'll talk about the question, the civil rights question. All right, which is your weekly question. Okay, so I think we did kind of end last time with TV and politics and the growing importance of television and politics. And that really is the era where TV really matters in political campaigns. And you see it especially in commercials. Oh, I forgot I was going to share that living room candidate site with you. But you see it with commercials and you see it with debates. So the first televised presidential debate is the 1961 with Nixon and Kennedy. And I know we talked about this last time, because Kennedy appeared healthier, better looking, that sort of thing. We voted for him. And that does tend to be a thing in elections where, well, just in our elections for president, if there's somebody who really fits the definition of being more attractive, and sometimes we have candidates and we just go, nope, 0 for 2. But if there's somebody who fits the definition of being more attractive, we tend to vote for them. If both candidates are male, which is typical, we also tend to vote for the tallest one, which I am highly offended by as a shorter person. But, if you people like tall folks, I guess that's just the way it goes. And in this election, I don't know. Yeah, all right. Okay. So Kennedy-Nixon debate around 1960. Kennedy probably prevailed in the election because of that, or because a lot of dead people voted. There's that as well. But that was the closest election in history to that point. And the 2000 election, closer and also litigated, which you are about to see, I think, with the current one, which is moderately interesting. All right. Also way more than moderately interesting, not just because it's your weekly question, but because it's the civil rights movement, you really see the advent of the modern civil rights movement. And there are a couple things that are really come into play with the civil rights movement. One, World War II. I think it's really hard to overstate the importance of World War II in the civil rights movement. If you study the civil rights movement in depth, which I'm not exactly expecting you to, even though you have one question about it, you'll notice that lots and lots of the leaders of this part of the civil rights movement served in the military. James Meredith, the fellow who integrates Ole Miss, the University of Mississippi, served in the military. Heman Sweat, who helps to integrate the University of Texas Law School, he served in the military. Several of the people who work directly with the NAACP's legal team also served in the military. So you have a lot of people with military background who come back, they have the GI Bill and they get free college, which is great. But if you're Black in some regions of the country, Hispanic or Asian, you can't go to college because there aren't any colleges that let you in. So that's the problem. And these folks are problem solvers. So they're going to solve the problem. And the NAACP is very glad to help them solve the problem. Oliver Brown, Brown versus Board of Education, I believe he had served in the military as well. And you see a lot of military background in a lot of the people involved in the civil rights movement. So things that happen in addition to World War II, and the reason that matters, there are a lot of reasons that matters. I'm sorry if I wasn't very clear about this. There's hundreds of thousands of African Americans who serve in World War II. And even though I know the military is still segregated and troops are treated badly, and your book pointed out, like even Jackie Robinson, of course, I know they didn't know he's a great baseball player yet. I almost gave him the wrong sport. He was mistreated and stood up for himself at Fort Hood in Texas. So you see the background of these folks who serve overseas and have military training. They're in really good shape. They're problem solvers by nature. And they also go overseas and defeat racism overseas. And you saw in the World War II chapter a really good discussion of the Double V movement, which you certainly could include in your answer if you liked, which talks about victory over racism overseas. So we might as well have victory over racism within the United States. Why wouldn't you? And then African Americans who returned to the Deep South, which is still where the majority of African Americans lived, and are told that public facilities are going to be segregated by people who, didn't serve overseas, aren't as patriotic in their view. They're just not going to put up with that anymore. It's like, why should I, a war hero, have to be told by some person who didn't fight overseas which bathroom I can use, or which water fountain I can use, or which bus seat I can sit in. So, goodness. Sorry. Somebody was trying to get in and I think I blocked them. So sorry if I blocked you. It was not my goal. All right. So World War II, I think I said that like 5 times. Okay. Truman desegregating the military and the To Secure These Rights report, which suggested that every public thing needed to be desegregated. And this is, for desegregation in the military, I believe the executive orders in 48, and the To Secure These Rights is it's right around the same time. So the Truman administration pushing in a new way for civil rights is probably quite useful. So you see the executive branch, or at least parts of the executive branch, being insistent on civil rights. And you'll see the Democrats add it to their platform, even though I know who the Democrats are in the Deep South. Those folks are not pushing for civil rights just yet. Okay, so Yeah, World War II, the effects of World War II, Double V campaign, training, GI Bill, that sort of thing. You've got Truman administration desegregating the military and the To Secure These Rights report. And then in 54, it's a big deal, Brown versus Board of Education. So we could talk all day about Brown versus Board of Education. Some of you are going like, man, I hope we do. I know you're not saying that, by the way. But Brown versus Board of Education is the legal foundation for the civil rights movement. So you need to know about Brown versus Board of Education, not just for this question, not for your multiple choice questions, but just for life, you know, to be a good American citizen. If it were up to me, like at HEB, when you checked out, they would ask you, do you understand the significance of Brown versus Board of Education? And if you didn't, they wouldn't give you your food. That's how important it is to me. But I got to work on this with HEB, really improve the quality of history education in Texas. But Brown versus Board of Education is a Supreme Court case that desegregates public schools. Now, this did not happen accidentally, and it didn't happen quickly. I know we've mentioned before, sorry for the yawn, that Charles Hamilton Houston designed a school, a law school at Howard University, historically black college in DC, strictly to teach people to argue at the Supreme Court to overturn Plessy versus Ferguson. So this has been a long-term goal of Houston and the NAACP. He eventually worked for the NAACP and ran their legal unit. And the court cases about this started in the 1920s. So this really is a long-term project. And Houston's most famous student is Thurgood Marshall. So he's going to recruit Thurgood Marshall, and Thurgood Marshall will eventually argue Brown versus Board of Education in front of the Supreme Court. Now, the Plessy versus Ferguson, just reminder, 1896 case. I would probably require you to know that at HEB as well. But Plessy versus Ferguson was the court case that said segregation was okay, separate but equal. And that was the guy in the train cars in Louisiana. And his goal was to desegregate public facilities, and the opposite happened. So once that case, Plessy, 1896, is established, then segregation spreads throughout the country. Brown versus Board of Education is the end of this process that started in the 20s with desegregating different types of schools. So they knew they couldn't go straight to public school because that would be too controversial. So they started with stuff they thought judges would be okay with. So they started with law school, which makes perfect sense if you think about it, because every judge has gone to law school. They have. I mean, it's sort of a rule. Although I know there are some places where we elect judges, so technically they don't have to have law school, but if you're appealing cases in the federal system, they've all gone to law school. Sorry. So the argument in the first case, I'm sorry, I don't remember the name of it, was that if lawyers didn't go to the exact same classes, you know, even if you had like the University of Texas segregated law school, which is what the Sweatt case was about, which was like Heman Sweatt in the basement by himself with some law books. Or, I mean, you had the University of Texas School of Law for African Americans. That's not exactly what they called it, but that's what I'll translate it as. Sorry, they said Negroes back in those days. And that was appropriate in those days. It wasn't worse than that. I've just thought about that. It's like, I don't want you to think they called it something worse. So that law school was segregated. So Heman Sweatt's argument was, through the NAACP, that I can't get the same education in law school without the same arguments, the same teachers, the same students in the classroom, because so much of law school is interactive, and it's about the argument and it's about the class discussion. So without that, you're not on an equal footing. So the courts went, yeah, that makes sense. And in their ruling, in the Sweatt ruling, they specifically said This ruling only applies to law school because they understood what the NAACP was trying to do, and the Supreme Court was not ready to desegregate very much of anything because it was a very conservative body. It just was. So the next cases were to desegregate medical schools for the same reason. So medical school, then schools of nursing, then all graduate school, then colleges, and then public school. So it's a process, and it's a very, very long process. Part of the reason that it works in 54 is because the Chief Justice dies in the middle of the case. And I don't mean like on the bench he dies, but I don't know how much you know about how the Supreme Court works, but people send cases, refer cases to the Supreme Court, and then the Supreme Court they have conferences where they decide which cases they're going to take. There's typically 9 people on the Supreme Court in the modern era for like the last 150 years. And they have a vote, and in their vote, if 4 justices, so 4 out of 9, agree that they want to take the case, then they take the case. So with the Brown case, which was a consolidation of 4 different cases, there was one in, let's see if I get this right, one in Virginia, one in South Carolina, one clearly in Kansas, and then one, I think the other one was in Georgia, but it was a 3 southern states, and then Kansas, which is not very southern. For those of you that don't leave the state very often, we got Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas, so it's right in the middle of the country. So the court decided to take the case, but they weren't very excited about it. Then the Chief Justice dies, and the Chief Justice had already said in their hearings, and they had already had, they'd already heard oral arguments. He'd already said that he really favored just sticking with Plessy versus Ferguson. So he dies because he's old. And then Eisenhower replaces him, and he replaces him with a guy named Earl Warren. Now, I know you are probably watching the Supreme Court hearings in your free time, which you have none of, which I understand. I might have watched them quite a bit. And they were a little controversial, not as much as the Neil Gorsuch ones, and certainly not as much as some, in recent history. But, there were arguments, was she qualified? Did she have enough experience? And, those arguments didn't stick very well because she's fairly qualified and had some experience. Earl Warren had been the governor of California. That was his qualification. And he had gone to law school, but he had not been a lawyer in a while. He had never served as a judge, and he had not been on an appellate court, district court, and clearly wasn't already a member of the Supreme Court. The reason that Earl Warren became Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is because he had run Eisenhower's presidential campaign in California. So he helped Eisenhower win California. So his reward was he got appointed to the Supreme Court. Now, if you're wondering, was that controversial? Are you wondering that? You're going like, no, just tell me the story. It was not controversial during that time period, which must seem a little odd. Does it seem a little odd to you? I mean, because he hadn't even really been a practicing lawyer in some time. Now, he wasn't just a dud who didn't know anything about the law. It wouldn't be like if for some reason whoever is the new president said, you know what, I hear that Serna is a really great history teacher. I think I'd like to see her on the Supreme Court. That'd be pretty out of bounds because I haven't gone to law school. And some of you are like, she's not even that great of a history teacher. But I'm not qualified to be on the Supreme Court. I'm not completely sure in a lot of ways Earl Warren was qualified, but in that era, if the president appointed them and they weren't criminals, they didn't have anything sketchy in their background, the Senate just approved them. The idea that the Senate really started looking closely at people's credentials and their views on on certain cases. That's very modern. You know, well, you don't know. Maybe you know, I don't know. That started with the Bork hearings in the 90s. And then, of course, we saw, you know, lots of excitement with Clarence Thomas and some other stuff. But that kind of scrutiny over Supreme Court nominees is very modern. I promise you, it's very modern. So when Earl Warren, former governor of California, is getting rewarded for running Eisenhower's campaign in California and helping him get elected, when he gets appointed to the Supreme Court, the Senate goes, okay, that's cool. They don't even bat an eye. Now, the people already on the court are like, oh my gosh, did they really just appoint another unqualified person? They're not super excited that Earl Warren is the Chief Justice, much less a dude on the Supreme Court, because they don't think he's qualified. But he does kind of he more than kind of earns their respect. And it turns out he was quite a serious jurist and certainly had studied well in law school and took his job seriously, but he also had some political skills, which sometimes the justices don't have. So, and they're not really supposed to. Point of all that, when Earl Warren gets on the Supreme Court, rather than leading a lot of the conferences, he listens to people. He tries to get the advice of the most senior members, or at least the most scholarly member, who's widely agreed to be a guy named Felix Frankfurter, whom you may remember from earlier times, wrote the big magazine article about why Sacco and Vanzetti should not have been executed. And he's an unusual fellow, Frankfurter. He's an immigrant fellow from Austria. He's also agnostic, which is not going to be very popular in the 50s. It just isn't. So an agnostic guy is one of those guys. It's like, yeah, I know there's probably a God, a creator, at least a guy that's a whatever entity that set everything in motion, but I don't think we can know a God personally or have a personal relationship with him. He's also Jewish, so which is clearly an ethnic background rather than a religious background for him, since I just mentioned, you know, he's not a practicing religious person. So that guy ends up, Felix Frankfurter ends up taking the lead on the points of argument. And then Earl Warren, when he leads the first conference that he leads about this case, just says, look, it's very clear, it's way past time to overturn Plessy versus Ferguson. And then they all just look at him like, oh my gosh, did he really just say this? And he says, we have to do this in a way that will show leadership in the country. So if we have a 5-4 decision, that just tells the rest of the country it's still worth fighting about. So we have to have a unanimous decision. And he told him, I'm not trying to force you to do this. I don't want you to vote this way unless you are truly convinced it's legally viable to overturn this case. So when Brown versus Board of Education, when the the majority opinion is issued, and the opinion is issued and the majority is written, Earl Warren writes the majority opinion, and it is 9-0, which was very interesting because there were some very Southern segregationists on the court. But they were convinced that the 14th Amendment meant what it said, and it also meant school. So really interesting ruling, which is not well accepted in the South. That'll be my understatement of the day. However, the 9-0 thing was pretty helpful as far as starting to implement the rules or this desegregation, because they saw that the court case was unanimous, so it wasn't questionable among a group of really diverse Supreme Court justices from all different regions of the country. So that helped, but not completely in the South, because they, traditions and things like that. So it goes a little more smoothly in the North, a little less smoothly in the South. But Brown versus Board of Education decided in '54, and it desegregates public schools. 55, I think, is the Montgomery bus boycott. So I assume that everyone who's ever gone to public school knows about Rosa Parks and not giving up her seat. And you know, she, of course, is not the first person at all that refused to give up their seat in a bus, you know, refused to move from the front to the back. The way that the bus segregation typically worked is if the bus wasn't full, if everybody who was on the bus was African American, then you could sit wherever you want. When white people got on the bus, then Black people moved to the back. It was just custom, tradition, and law. And on this day, Mrs. Parks decided not to do this. And she was arrested, and she asked the police officer, I don't understand, you know, why you're doing this. And the police officer pretty frankly said, I don't either, it's just the law. So, and this worked nicely for Mrs. Parks. I know I had just mentioned she's not the only person who'd ever done this, but she's an educated woman. She's highly respected in her community. And she's the secretary for the head of the NAACP in Montgomery, in Alabama. And the people who had been arrested before were not as publicly respectable as she was. Sometimes they were younger folks, single parents, maybe they hadn't finished high school. So I know it sounds maybe bad or sad, maybe, I don't know, but they had to pick the right person to lead the movement to desegregate the buses. They did, because if they picked someone else, then what they would do is talk about that person rather than the issue. So there was, Mrs. Parks was unassailable. Rosa Parks was, you know, the perfect public persona to lead this. She was a quiet, respectable woman who was clearly very assertive, but in a calm and quiet sort of way. And if you're wondering, did that mean people left her alone? No, they firebombed her house. So she ends up, of course, following through on this, and it leads to the emergence of a fairly important civil rights leader, a guy named Martin Luther King Jr. And if you're wondering, why did they pick Martin Luther King Jr.? A variety of reasons. You know, probably because you've heard at least I Have a Dream speech. You know, the man could write, and he was a very good public speaker. And you know that that probably comes from the preaching thing, because, you know, those guys get some practice at talking. However, Dr. King had just finished his doctorate in divinity, so he just graduated from college. And because of this, he hadn't been arrested. So they needed somebody to lead the movement that hadn't been arrested. And I know you're thinking, like, how could they not have people that hadn't been arrested? Were there a bunch of criminals leading the civil rights movement? Yes and no. They typically were arrested for leading civil rights demonstrations. So they'd get arrested for disturbing the peace. And Dr. King's going to get arrested several times and stabbed, and lots of things will happen to him before the ultimate terrible thing that happens to him. But they picked Dr. King not just because of his qualifications, but also because he was young and had no criminal record yet. And they also planned civil rights demonstrations at certain times. And they also invited the news media. And they typically planned these demonstrations in the afternoon. They invited the news media so that things would be filmed and processed in time to make the evening news. They also picked days that they knew more people watched the news. So this is a very savvy civil rights movement. You know, all of this is planned and of course, I know that you expected that it was planned, but it's more than just, we've got to make sure we get enough people and we've got to be at the right place. They're also right time, the right people at the events, making sure the wrong people aren't there, because they understood, and this may be a hard thing to think about, but Dr. King especially understood that for the civil rights movement to be successful, the people who really had to be on board were middle-class white people. And middle-class white people in that era, some of you are going like, and still, are easily offended by certain things. One of those things is violence. So this had to be a nonviolent civil rights movement. Now, Dr. King felt that way anyway, and certainly had studied Reinhold Niebuhr, Gandhi, and certainly had that philosophy. That was not, I mean, that's part of why he's the right leader for this. But they understood that if they were ever seen fighting with the police, even if the police hit them first or did things they weren't supposed to do, that's the clip that would be on the news. It would be like, supposedly nonviolent civil rights protesters strike the police. That would be the story. So they had to make sure that nothing about them personally or their actions were the story. This had to be, they were 100% completely perfect, and the other side of the argument was 100% at fault, which is tricky. Would you guys believe there's someone at my door? It does sound familiar. Do you mind if we stop for just a minute? Because I have a feeling I know who this is. So, do you mind if we stop? Take a little break? All right, like 2 minutes. So let me see if I can remember how to pause the recording. Okay. All right, back to business. Thanks for the little break. Okay, so, oh, Martin Luther King Jr. Yeah, that's exactly what my dad asked 5 years, or no, more than 5 years, because the car is 2013. So he said, yeah, it's bad. Probably is. Okay, always the same question. Okay, Martin Luther King Jr., yeah, I don't know if he could, yeah, probably is the battery. I don't know if Dr. King could have fixed cars. Probably not. I don't think that was his skill. Oops, wrong button. I'm trying to share the screen again. So Dr. King picked for specific reasons, certainly very skilled. If you guys have heard speeches, you know, but Dr. King's the man. And Rosa Parks is the perfect plaintiff. And of course, the buses are desegregated. Now, the Montgomery bus boycott, if you study this a lot, which is kind of a fun thing to study, and if you want to read a book about that, I would encourage you, because I like that stuff clearly. I'm super excited about it. But it's led by a lot of female professors, yes, women college professors, in part because they have access to copiers. So to organize the boycott, and they have to do it really quickly, they've got to get the word out. And the women, and these are primarily women professors at traditionally Black colleges, so Black female professors really get this thing organized and do almost all the behind the scenes groundwork. And if you're wondering as well, in the Deep South, why the civil rights movement is centered around churches, because you got to have a place to meet. So the Black church is a hugely important institution throughout the South. I'm not saying it isn't in the North, but there's no public meeting facilities for African Americans in the South other than churches. And they tended to be pretty big. And law enforcement tended to stay away from churches. So the center of the movement in the South is African American churches. You'll see a lot of the spokesmen as the preachers, not all, but a lot. That's also why the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was such an important organizing part of this, plus Black women who taught in school and in colleges, especially in colleges, because they had a little more freedom and autonomy to print things and organize events, that sort of thing. So the Montgomery bus boycott lasts for over a year. And the bus company is going bankrupt because African Americans said, we are not getting on the bus again until Jim Crow gets off, until desegregation ends. And those companies go, we would rather go bankrupt than to desegregate. So they were on the verge of bankruptcy and just didn't care. It's amazing, because you would think, and a lot of times it was true, that money was really, really talked, but these guys were committed, really committed to segregation. And what eventually happens is it goes through the court system, and the courts excuse me, issued an injunction that said that the public buses had to desegregate. They had to. So they did, and then it's all over. So in a year with a lot of organization and fighting and ride sharing and walking, a lot of stuff. So a lot of planning, but it's a really impressive undertaking. It really is. And it's nonviolent and organized and committed, and it is fascinating and publicly really important as well. So I don't know, to me, this part of the civil rights movement, it's way more work than it should have had to be, but it's impressive the amount of work and organization and planning these folks were willing to go to. If you study the whole of the civil rights movement, which clearly I've spent some time doing, there's a fellow named Bayard Rustin. Let's see if I can find the chat and I'll type his name in there. And if you haven't picked a book yet to read and you want to read a book for the book review, I'd suggest a book about him. There's also a pretty good video about him called Brother Outsider. I'm the worst at typing, so this may take a second. Oh, that's a bad misspelling. That's a really bad misspelling. Or typo. Okay, Bayard Rustin. And Bayard Rustin hosts summer trainings for civil rights workers, which sounds like a weird summer camp, where you go and you get screamed at and spit on and kicked and beaten and that sort of stuff. And you practice not punching people back or spitting back at them, which sounds like a terrible summer camp. But he talked about, I mean, they taught them nonviolent theory. They studied, you know, certain philosophers, religious leaders, but they also taught them physical techniques about how to roll up into a ball in a certain way where they're more protected. So Bayard Rustin led the summer camp for civil rights protesters. But Bayard Rustin is an unusual fellow. He is an openly gay Black man. And because he's an openly gay Black man, whether he's Black or white, the openly gay part in the 50s is not okay, because, you know, they're communist and that sort of thing. So Bayard Rustin can't officially be part of the civil rights movement. He also plans the March on Washington in '63 with I Have a Dream speech. He is hugely important to the civil rights movement, but very, yeah, I think we're still recording. I think so. Oh, gosh. But, you know, very important to the civil rights movement and very much in the background, very much in the background, and understood he had to be in the background to be effective. But every major civil rights leader knew him and valued what he did, but they understood the time period and knew that he couldn't be an official outward part of the leadership, which is weird, maybe, and not for the time period. All right, I know I keep talking about this stuff, and I probably need to wrap this up. So we'll talk kind of quickly about Little Rock Central, which is mentioned in the chapter. I always assume you're familiar with this as well, but you may not be. This is 57, I think, pretty sure. And the NAACP is trying to get Southern states to follow Brown versus Board of Education, which they are not doing. So they find 9 African-American kids who are willing to integrate a school of about 2,000 kids, Little Rock Central High School. And if you're ever in Little Rock, I did make my husband go to Little Rock Central High School one time. We also went to the Clinton Presidential Museum. And here's some things I found out. Both of those things are really fascinating and interesting. They're both in some interesting parts of town. I didn't realize there was a bad side of Little Rock because I hadn't been. Little Rock Central, it wasn't a rough side of town in '57, but it is kind of now. So if you go, it's my advice to you, if you go to see these things, check the hotel advisor, you know, the online reviews of the hotels. If they say don't stay here, it's a bad neighborhood, they're not kidding. I stayed at one of those hotels. It was very interesting. And my husband just looked at me like, oh my gosh, I'm never letting you make arrangements again. And, you know, after that, I was much more cautious. However, it is still, the facade of the school is still beautiful. And it's got that fountain out in front. But anyway, sorry. The governor of the state of Arkansas said, you know what? We are not desegregating this school. I don't care about Brown versus Board of Education. You do not tell us what to do. States' rights, go team. So this Orville Faubus fellow decided he would call in the Arkansas National Guard to prevent these 9 kids from going to school. So at bayonet point, they prevented these 9 kids from going to school. And the NAACP had a little car, a little wagon, where they took them all to school, but one of them missed the car. So she got dropped off by her family, and then she got kind of isolated from everybody else. And then people were threatening to kill her. And he was in a bad spot. And what ended up happening, you'll see a clip of this if you watch that video that I told you was kind of long. But what ends up happening to her is some old grandma comes over to her and tells all those kids to stop harassing her and rides the city bus home with her to make sure she's safe. If you're wondering, like, is old grandma white or black? Old grandma's white, because old grandmas don't like to see people messing with kids. So go old grandma. I mean, it's to me, it's like a super poignant part of that, but most of this is not super poignant. It's mostly pretty rough. Okay, so Eisenhower, who's not really big on civil rights, my assessment, not necessarily yours, got a problem here because he's got some governors, some really small southern state telling him federal court rulings don't matter. And he's got to decide, do I enforce the court ruling or not? So he decides the 101st Airborne and I will enforce this court ruling. So he sends paratroopers to the school, and each of those 9 kids gets their own paratrooper for a semester. And the first couple of weeks that they're there, they have a lot of the 101st Airborne there. So they have as many, I think they have 1,000 paratroopers that they send at first. So almost, 1 for every 2 students. And those 9 black kids went to school. They did. Now, 8 of them end up finishing the whole year. One of them gets kicked out because she retaliates for some stuff that happened to her. The paratroopers, the individual ones that stay with each student, they stay for the first semester. They're gone the second semester, which is when stuff starts happening to the kids and the one retaliates. The one guy who finishes the whole year is Ernest Green. You could read books about him as well. And Disney made the Ernest Green story, which if you ever teach younger kids, is a very acceptable civil rights video because you don't hear any of the words and the bad language. It's really produced for children. So it's a pleasant retelling of a not very pleasant story. So Ernest Green graduates. And then the state of Arkansas says, we know Eisenhower's not that big on civil rights, but we just tossed it in his face there and said, we will not desegregate. We are sending in the state National Guard. They said, let's do it a little more behind the scenes. So what they decided to do was just not have public high school the next couple of years. They said, you know what? We don't want to mess with this desegregation thing. It's too hard on everybody. So we're just closing our public high schools. I know what some of you are thinking right now. Is that why the quality of education is poor in Arkansas? Don't be like that. It's no, probably that's not it. What they did instead is they issued vouchers. So they gave every kid in Arkansas a voucher, and they could use that voucher to go to whatever school they wanted to. Private schools could segregate and did in the South. So this is also why, if you study public education much, which I probably have more than the average person, voucher programs in their original form, I'm talking 50s, were instituted to promote segregation, which is why older civil rights kind of people get really upset about vouchers. It's like, segregation. That really was the original reason for them in southern states in the 50s. So I'm not saying that, that's why people like them now. I am saying that it brings back historical thoughts of this time period. So the state of Arkansas didn't have public high school for 2 years. And Eisenhower, the federal government, didn't do anything about it, didn't say like, this is just a way to get around the ruling. They all knew that it was, but they didn't do it. So this is part of that strategy of massive resistance. where the southern states just say, you know what, we'll just pretend Brown versus Board of Education never happened, and we will find ways to make sure school is not desegregated. And that's going to be an issue for the next 2 decades, maybe longer. I'm old enough to remember, like when I was a little kid, I know we've talked about how old I am before, but when I was a little kid and started elementary school, which must have been 71, 72, somewhere around there, schools were still segregated where I lived. And there was definitely like the black park and the white park, the black school and the white school. And, you know, some of that was by where you lived, but there were lots of reasons that people only lived in certain parts of town, because real estate agents had kind of unwritten codes where they wouldn't sell people property in certain parts of town. So there's going to end up being court cases about that as well. So Brown versus Board of Education is really the start of desegregation, but it's the legal foundation for it. And some of you also probably have seen the movie Remember the Titans. I always forget the name of it. And I know when I taught high school, it was the end of the year after STAR test, it's like, hey, let's watch Remember the Titans. And the kids go like that. Because the music's really good. The music is really good. You know, it's got Denzel Washington, which, you know, what movie with Denzel Washington could be bad? But he's a football coach, and they're desegregating their football team, and it's based on a true story. And it happens in the 1970-71 school year in Virginia, which is kind of south and not completely south. But this should tell you everything you need to know about how desegregation of public schools goes. If we have a movie we like about desegregating public schools in 1970 and 71 that's based on a true story, that's a sign this doesn't happen right away. It's a process, and it's a long process. And when they issued the ruling that said that public schools should be desegregated with all deliberate speed, deliberate doesn't mean right away, it means take your time. And the southern states went, okay, we will take our time. And they did. So there's a ton more stuff in your book about civil rights stuff. You should have more than you ever need, maybe, to answer that question. I hope so. We'll look at the question here in a minute, and I'll just kind of wrap up the 1960 election, and you know, maybe we'll get an update on the car too. I don't know. 1960 election, we've talked about this before. Nixon versus Kennedy. Nixon, Eisenhower's VP, a little more conservative than Eisenhower, which the South would probably be okay with, but the North would be a little leery of. Kennedy's problem is he's a New England elite kind of guy. So that is not going to play well in the country, and it's not going to play well in the South. This is why, I'm sorry, I was just pausing to think, like, who is Nixon's vice presidential candidate, which is so weird that I can't even remember, but I can't. Kennedy's is LBJ, and that's not an accident either. Kennedy needs somebody. We talk about this all the time. It's true back then, it's true now. You pick a vice presidential candidate who appeals to people you don't appeal to. Kennedy knew who he didn't appeal to, so he picks LBJ. LBJ's got that ranch hand kind of vernacular, so he sounds like an old Southern racist dude. He is not. He is an old Southern dude. He's not a racist dude, but dang, he's got some salty language, to say the least. LBJ is an interesting character. We'll spend a lot of time talking about him as we move forward, because civil rights movement, he's going to do hugely important stuff in there. He's going to try to end poverty, which some of you go like, good job, way to go. And some of you go like, nice idea, terrible, terrible plans. But also Vietnam, and very few of you are going to go like, good job in Vietnam, LBJ. I don't know very many people who say that, but LBJ pulls the South a little bit towards Kennedy, and Kennedy's got the Catholic issue. We've never elected a Catholic before. He's also kind of young. He looks younger than he is. He's in his 40s. I think he's 42, because Teddy Roosevelt was 41 when he became president. Kennedy, JFK, will be the youngest guy ever elected president. But Kennedy's a legit guy. He's got a Purple Heart in World War II. He's got an education from Harvard. He has a background as a journalist, but some people, you know, because he comes from money, people are a little concerned about him. But he's done some legitimate things. And people kind of overlook the Catholic thing because he does a little "I'm not that Catholic" campaign, which we find out later on he's not kidding about that. He was not super devout about all tenets of the Catholic faith, as we will discover later. Nixon's more of your middle class guy. You know, he's the guy you already know. He's tough on communism. But you've also got Kennedy with the World War II background. So that kind of balances out. And probably, maybe, who knows, the televised debate and Kennedy just in general being more attractive maybe pushed him over the edge. Some people would also argue that there's some election irregularities in Illinois, where the Kennedy family seems to have a lot of control over the political system in Chicago. By election irregularities, I mean a lot of dead people voting. And apparently dead people really preferred Democrats over Republicans. And because the election was so close, there was the possibility for Nixon to contest the election, and he decided not to because he thought it would be too divisive for the country. So he doesn't. Yeah, okay. All right, let me see if I can find the questions, weekly questions. Okay. I think I didn't open those yet, so let me open them first. Study guide, weekly question. Here we go. All right, but you can't see it, can you? All right. Poo-poo. All right, one more try. There we go, weekly questions. Almost done. You're going like, thank God, it's almost over. Come on, it was interesting. Don't be like that. So the civil rights movement gained momentum in the 50s, nearly 90 years after Reconstruction. Explain why the movement took off in the 50s, what caused it to do so. Think back to previous chapters. And then your next question, you know, for the next chapter is about, is the country freer, more open, more tolerant? You can reflect on the civil rights movement a little bit in that question as well. But there's a ton of stuff in the chapter. You know, again, I would mention, you might start with Plessy versus Ferguson, just mention it, but don't spend a lot of time on it. But you want to talk about World War II, you want to talk about Brown versus Board of Education, you want to talk about Montgomery bus boycott, you probably want to mention Little Rock Central, you could mention Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr., Bayard Rustin, although I don't think that chapter talks about Rustin. I think the next chapter does a little bit. But, oh, sorry for the big yawn there. But I think there's enough specific stuff to talk about that in this chapter and stuff that you already know that I think this one should be pretty good for you. Now, be sure that you mention 3 or 4 specific things. Don't just, you know, generally this, that, and the other thing. And when you talk about those specific things, name names, places, and dates. Also, when you put those dates in, you'll see them. Put those in chronological order, and it helps show cause and effect. I think dates are way more important than you do as a group. I don't mean you individually. So include a date, even if it's just in parentheses, to help you organize your answer. I'm also going to strongly suggest to you, and I know it's hard because you guys are busy, that you not turn in your answer without proofreading it. And I don't mean about the spelling and grammar, and that. Don't worry so much about that, even though I know I occasionally correct it, it's just habit. But just to make sure it's in the order that you like and that it says what you think it should say. If you've got someone at your house that will read it for you, or maybe just read it out loud to see if it sounds like what you think it sounds like, sometimes proofreading your own work is hard. Also, if you use your word processor, it'll have like a little red line under stuff that might be confusing. But sometimes that's just grammar. So, all right. Oh, goodness. I'm tired. I don't know why. All right, we'll stop here in a minute, and I'll stop recording here in a sec. But do you guys have any questions that you want to ask? And don't run off just yet. If you can stay for a second, I just want to double check on the roll. Okay, so if you have a question, say something or put it in the chat. Yeah, there's something. All right, we got a spokesperson saying you're good. Appreciate it. I'm going to go ahead and stop recording.